Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Whenever you get one of these from someone in your family as a present, you think, oh, this is a fantastic toy. And you, as a young person, you get very, very frustrated with it. But you know that there's a rational solution to solving it. In fact, if you go online, you will see rational solutions to solving this, right? And they tell you have to turn the sides and you have to move it around, et cetera, et cetera. Everything has a rational position. But then I thought, people who are really good at this thing can do it very, very quickly. And they don't really think about it. Like me. I just throw it in the air, and it comes down completely and utterly solved. Now, thank you very much. So I got thinking about that, and I was thinking about expert knowledge. Where does expert knowledge come from? And I was thinking about expert knowledge, the idea of rationality and the idea of intuition, and how they might come together. If we consider Pete Sampras, Gary Kasparov, John Coltrane, and Harry Houdini, what is it that they all have in common? Let's think about this idea of unconscious competence. If we consider John Coltrane, or we consider Harry Houdini, or Pete Sampras, or Gary Kasparov, clinical psychologists and cognitive psychologists say that Gary Kasparov doesn't think about each move that he makes. He thinks in cognitive chunking. He thinks in a collection of moves in order to control bits of territory of the chessboard. John Coltrane doesn't think about every note that he plays. He actually thinks about where he feels the music taking him. Right? Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't know how to play the saxophone. It means that he spent so much time playing the saxophone that he transcends that set of rules, it transcends the logic of music, and then becomes a different performer altogether. I'd like to really pursue the argument that this is actually rational intuition, that what they're doing is combining the rational work that they've done. It means really doing that hard work to the point that you then become unconsciously competent about what you're doing and apply, in a way, your intuition to any new situation. Where does this come from? It comes from learning theory. Whenever we start out a task, we actually approach it unconsciously incompetent, which is when we start out a task, we don't even know we're bad at it. But as we move through and try to learn something, we become consciously incompetent. We know that we're bad at something, so that's the next step. As we practice that skill and work with that skill, we become consciously competent. Now, anyone who's tried to play an instrument or play a sport or do something new, you sit there and you kind of, your brain hurts practicing a guitar scale or chess moves, etc. You are so conscious of every move that you need to make that it's actually a painful experience. But with practice and time and experience, you get to this level of unconscious competence, and that's where you unknowingly are able to do things very well. And that, I think, is the world of rational intuition. Now, how do I get there? I want to start with philosophy. If we consider wax, if we consider a candle and we look at it, it's a solid. But when we light it and it burns, it becomes a liquid. And philosophers, this was a problem. Is it a solid or is it a liquid? Right? The constitution of objects is a really big problem in philosophy. Descartes says that knowledge is separated between that which we observe and perceive and that which we know through rational intuition. Now, this phrase, rational intuition, that he uses is radically different from mine. Because he actually says that radical intuition is those things that are apparent to us by reason, like 2 + 2 = 4. You don't even have to think about it. And it's something that can be trusted, and it's pure. Mathematics is pure. Now, this separation between observation and that which we achieve through rational intuition is important for what I'm about to say today. If we consider strategic rationality all on its own, on one side, the way we think about things in the material world and what the economists have to say, we know the economists base strategic rationality on material self-interest of the individual and the intentional choices that individuals make to maximize that self-interest. So you make choices. You have a constrained basket, right? You have constraints on income, but yet you maximize your preferences based on the available resources that you have at hand. So this idea of preferences, utility maximization, drives modern economic analysis. Preferences are funny, though. They're transitory. If I prefer Coke to Pepsi to Sprite, I also prefer Coke to Sprite. If I did not prefer Coke to Sprite under this formulation, I would be considered irrational. If I come into the office in the morning on Monday and say, I'd like a Coke, please, and the next day I come in and say I'm going to have a Pepsi, two things the economists would conclude. One is you've become irrational, or you've changed your preferences, right? Or Coke was not available and you went for your second best option, right? So that's, in a way, how strategic rationality is employed to understand the exercise of preferences. But what happens if my preferences interact with your preferences? Because that's where the market takes place. It's the exchange of ideas, the exchange of goods, and trading of substance, yeah? So when we interact with equally rational and strategic people, many outcomes are possible. And one of the most famous applications of this idea is the prisoner's dilemma. What do you do in the prisoner's dilemma? You have two suspects, guilty or suspected of a crime, separated, separate rooms, and you play on the mutual mistrust between those two people, knowing that they are rational and knowing that they have a preference to stay out of prison. And we know that when people, prisoner 1 and prisoner 2, interact with each other, there are a number of outcomes that are possible. They can cooperate with one another, or one can defect and the other one can seek cooperation. The array of outcomes is you get rewarded for cooperation, you get rewarded for defection if you're the defector, but you get punished if you're the cooperator and your partner defects, right? He gets 5 and you get 0. We call that the sucker's payoff. And vice versa, okay? And ultimately, if you both defect, you reduce your punishment to the lowest level possible. So it's in the criminal's self-interest to continue to stick to their story and not defect on their partner. But the police say, oh, they're in the room over there, and they're absolutely singing like a bird. They said you did the entire thing all yourself. You planned it. You drove the van. You stole the television, right? And then they go in the other room, and they tell that prisoner the same story. And on that mistrust, you'll get any one of these 4 outcomes by holding those prisoners separate. What does this have to do with anything? Quite a lot as it happens. In World War I, there is this very strange case of live and let live, documented in a book by Robert Axelrod called The Evolution of Cooperation. And here he found that forces, the British and the Germans, were coming up out of their trenches at a particular time of day and having tea on the field, and then going back down and then shelling each other. But they never killed each other. They learned over time, through interaction with one another, that it was rational to take their guns and aim them slightly higher so that they missed one another. They were following orders, they were firing their weapons, right? But they weren't killing each other, they were preserving their own lives. Of course, when the generals found out, they made them lower their guns. Now, the intended outcome is to decimate the opponent. The observed behavior is that there was a failure to hit their targets, and there was absence of real combat. And what we learned from that story is that cooperation is actually possible under many prolonged iterations with an opponent. So that's one application from looking at a strange case in World War I. A slightly more modern example involves what we see now in the Arab Spring and the process of democratization. What we see here, very interestingly, is that if you focus on softliners in the authoritarian regime, those people who are most likely to want liberalization, these are people who think if we liberalize the authoritarian state, we guarantee some public support and we stay in power. The hardliners say, no, we have to crack down on everyone. This is the Gaddafi strategy. This is the Assad strategy. In the opposition, you have radicals who say, never, ever, 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 ever negotiate with the government. Right? We'll die first. And you have reformers who say, I'm quite willing to engage with those softliners in the regime to take our country forward in a moment of transition. The interesting insights that come from this is that democracy is one of 4 possible outcomes. It's not inevitable. It's one of 4 outcomes. The structure of interaction between equally rational people, so the assumption goes, means that you could get these 3 other outcomes, where authoritarianism lasts, where it lasts with some weaknesses, or where democracy comes about but doesn't have guarantees. So there's a fragility in the democratic consensus. And we might find that Egypt, slightly after Mubarak leaves power, between that time and the current elections, was a very fragile moment where the country could go back to authoritarianism. There are a number of thoughts about intuition, that it's knowledge gained without rational thought. This might go back to this unconsciously competent thing I was saying earlier. Automated experience from Herbert Simon's work on constrained rationality. He said you don't actually have time to think through all the different options that you have. And people actually have a kind of constrained rationality in carrying out their tasks. Cares, Gill, and Zutney say enabled intuition, decision-making is refined to an art, and I like this idea of art, that actually at a certain level of professionalism and expertise, the decision-making that we have, that we utilize in our everyday lives becomes an art. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do is look at this costs, benefits, constraints, and the maximization of utility, and combine it with gut instincts, hunch, experience, subconscious thought, and minimizing thought. Right? What's the first thing that comes into your mind as a possible solution to a problem? And in between, I think this is my understanding of rational intuition. It's different than Descartes. It's not the purity of the mathematical deductive process, nor is it over-reliant on experience, but it's somewhere in between. I happen to do a bit of consultancy work with an organization based in Colchester called Glovenkowski International, and they have a set of tools for analyzing behavior in large organizations. These are statistical tools, analytical tools that try to measure people's predispositions and how that relates to their behavior within a given organizational climate. Now, we did some work in Hazley at a school, Hazley School in Milton Keynes. And what we did is we measured the predispositions of 116 youth at the school, and we find an interesting distribution, frequency distribution of their responses on a number of dimensions. On the one hand, we have this incremental and radical dimension. When you make decisions, do things incrementally, right? You do a little bit of experiment, a little bit of development, and move forward. Or do you just say, radical, absolute radis, cut it off at the root, I'm going to do something revolutionary. And we interact that with whether someone is highly focused, right? Or they big attention to detail. When you give someone a task, do they take the phone book approach to doing it? Or are they flexible? Are they cursory? Do they look at something kind of in the distance and come up with a solution? And I think all these things have something to say about my notion of rational intuition. Incrementalists are highly rational. They think about the consequences of their decisions and then make those decisions accordingly. Radical people use their intuition and say, I think this is the right thing to do, right? And there's a continuum along which you can plot people. And as you see, some of our students are right along that continuum, certainly from left to right, but also from north to south. Now, how do we apply rational intuition? How can we give good examples from the world of work where I come from that illustrate this? In Brazil, there was a problem of kids on the street. And the problem was that kids were going onto the street sometimes 2-3 hours away from their family home into the urban center and selling chicle, selling little bits and bobs for the tourists, and trying to make a living, if you will, on the street. The original solution was to criminalize these children, to send in the police, whack them into prison under conditions that were absolutely horrible, and there was great popular support for that, right, among the middle classes and the sort of gated communities, right? But it's not actually a solution to a problem because you end up criminalizing a whole cohort, a generation of young people. So the streets were cleaned of the kids, but the problem was not solved. Some NGOs and a political party went to families and said, why are your children going into the streets? They said to make money for the family unit. And they said, how much money do they make for the family unit? $25 a week. Okay, if we pay you $25 a week, will you keep your kids in school? And the answer was yes, right? Suddenly the schools were under pressure to find space. So they turned nightclubs that were used in the evening into schools during the day. And they got so many thousands of kids back into school, raised the literacy rates, and the investment to get those kids back into school was less than saving one failed bank in Sao Paulo, right? So the Bolsa Escola program is a great example of using that sort of rational intuition, schools by day, restaurants by night. Private incentives work, but knowledge of the context matters. If we think about this combination of cost, benefit, constraint, utility maximization, hunch, experience, subconscious, minimizing of thought, and where that might take us, I think we're all unconsciously competent at something. You may think it's completely mundane, but to someone who can't do that, it's really impressive. And that comes down to peeling a cucumber. How do you do that? I watch MasterChef. How do they do that? So I think we're all unconsciously competent about many things. I think we do need to liberate ourselves from the spreadsheet, and that's kind of shorthand for moving beyond the cost-benefit rationality calculation. You do, on many occasions, know what is right, and you know when it is right. Call it flash reasoning, call it quick thinking, whatever the fashionable word is, but I think there are elements there in all of us. We can act upon our inner flashes. And it seems to me this idea of practical wisdom, which is something that was actually developed initially in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, this idea of practical wisdom that comes from experience. You have the technical knowledge, you have the historical knowledge, you can do technical things, and yet there's this added wisdom that we have, practical wisdom, that we can apply to problems. And for me, that strategy plus guts can only mean success.
It occurs to me that when you look at the prisoner's dilemma, there is an individualistic solution, and that is to do what I want, regardless of what anybody else is going to do, and that will lead to the kind of what a single person defects kind of solution. There's a kind of egalitarian view, which is that we will cooperate, and that is a cooperative solution. Mm-hmm. But hierarchy is also an answer to this, because hierarchy is an answer to the fact that the problem with the prisoner's dilemma is that if you don't play it again and again and again, it doesn't lead to the right outcome. So actually, we need someone to come along and do things for us, because the prisoner's dilemma is inherently unstable. So we need someone to sort out issues for it, because if we leave it all to this, we're going to get it wrong all the time. And if you can argue, I guess, that fatalism is just a sense that the whole thing's bloody random, that there is no kind of ordered state in this. Anyway, I'm interested how you would relate those two ideas to each other in terms of insights about fundamental human nature.
There are many equilibria that are achieved through prisoner dilemma type solutions. So you said this thing about being inherently unstable. I'm not convinced of that. So there's really interesting research on what's called taking it in turns in politics. So in Venezuela and Colombia, after long periods of violence, both opposing sides decided that you are in power for 5 years and then I'm going to be in power for 5 years, at a party level, not an individual level, right? So there was a kind of individual meeting of minds that said, for the good of the country, this is the egalitarian public good part of the argument, we're going to take it in turns. The problem is that the prisoner's dilemma can explain that decision and the stasis, the equilibrium that results from that. What they can't explain is why the Venezuelans and the Colombians then opted for constitutional reform that broke down exactly that whole alternating power system. So I think the issue of evolution and the punctuated equilibria, to quote Stephen Jay Gould, is a real problem for the application of prisoner's dilemma. I don't think it's as bad as it's always unstable, but that there are moments of interruption that are difficult to explain, and I wonder if some of these other models that you're talking about in solutions of decision-making are there. Now, of course, Hobbes said that you need the Leviathan to impose order on those always warring individuals, right? So Hobbes had a much more dismal and dim view of human nature based on the Puritan Revolution in this country, and looked at everyone and looked at the violence and looked at the bloodshed and said, it's better to have a Leviathan that holds power over these warring people than it is to just let them to continue to be in that state of war. Now, in a way, that was a thought experiment. So the state of nature is very much a thought experiment and something that then leads to the conclusion that societies need a strong state, effectively, right? And then the question is, how do you then democratize that strong state? So the hierarchical model is one, well, authoritarian governments provide a solution for us. We don't have to think about where we go and what we do. And, for all the years of the Cold War, there were many societies organized along that way. And those were ultimately rejected as being too constraining. Yes, it's nice that you know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I think the individual striving for freedom is very much stronger ultimately and wants to break free from any kind of arrangement of imposition by hierarchies.
As I understand the latest thinking on the prisoner's dilemma, the stability of the prisoner's dilemma comes about when people's behavior over time reinforces the fact that cooperation works. So I kind of trust you. So if the prisoner's dilemma game is played once, I may defect. But if I know I'm going to be playing you again and again and again and again, we'll learn to cooperate and we'll keep cooperating, and you have an atmosphere of cooperation. But of course, the danger is you then become complacent. And at any moment in that situation of cooperation, I can spot the fact that Todd always cooperates because we've always cooperated. I could really screw him now because I can be absolutely sure that if I defect, I will win, right? I'm interested, therefore, in the issue of resilience in the context of conflict resolution, which is an area that you work in, which is that one of the things that one needs to achieve in conflict resolution is not just finding peace, but also the resilience to maintain peace when inevitably something goes wrong. I mean, we see this in Northern Ireland at the moment. So how do you maintain peace even when a tiny splinter group of the IRA is back to is back to blowing people up? Because the idea that you're going to establish peace forever is probably not going to. There will always be people who will defect. How important is that, do you think, in long-term conflict resolution?
Well, I think it all relies on the size of who's doing the deal. And when we looked at softliners and moderates, if you only have 2 or 3 softliners in the authoritarian regime, nothing's going to happen because the balance of power within the regime still favors the hardliners. Equally, in the opposition, if you are populated by 90% radicals, the 10% moderates are unlikely to be able to make a deal with the softliners. So it is a question of magnitude that allows you to move to the next stage in terms of a deal. In terms of making the deal stick, there's a rational argument and there's a cultural argument. The rational argument says, by having a chance to play the game in the future, you stay loyal to it in the present. right? So in democracy, a very thin view of democracy is our party lost during this election, but we know in 5 years' time we get to compete again, and the probability of us winning is contingent on how well we campaign, and we accept that the rules are fair and that we have a level playing field and all those other sorts of things. But the loyalty to the democratic system comes from the fact that I might be able to win in the future. Where that loyalty breaks down, of course, is where they think the rules are rigged, where there's corruption, where there's foreign intervention, where there's all those sorts of confounding factors that might break down that kind of equilibrium. From a cultural point of view, there is something that develops around that agreement that one might call a social norm and a set of values. So democracy is something that is of value in and of itself that transcends just people trading positions in government, right? That there's something that's much beyond this little trading game that goes on. And I think that's where this sort of intuitive side comes from, and that's where, whether it's cognitive chunking or improvising in jazz, that all of us as humans are certainly more than just sparring partners in a big battle.